And so we come to the last leg of Leonard Cohen's discography, and what a last leg it is. In the first half of Leonard Cohen's discography, we see a man wrestling with his own desires. He's pleased when they're fulfilled, he's aggrieved when they're not, he dreams of both union and of escape, and he's bothered to be someone who is so slavishly trapped in this cycle. In the second half, we begin to see Cohen turning away from that desire. Even as he compulsively alludes to women's naked bodies, he begins writing more expansively, not just about his own manifold desires, pleasures, and disappointments, but about the world. The brilliantly misshapen Various Positions marks the beginning of the Leonard Cohen Renaissance, the Lenaissance. And then we come to the last 4-album stretch of his career, which by Cohen standards was a furiously prolific period of work. Just 4 years elapsed between the release of Old Ideas in 2012 and his death in 2016, by which time he'd done the work that would comprise his posthumous album Thanks for the Dance. Before that, it had taken him 16 years to produce the 4 albums between I'm Your Man and Dear Heather. It seems that, like me, Cohen works well with a deadline. Leonard Cohen truly had one of popular music's most richly satisfying last legs of artistry. Let's dig in. Before we do, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to my page. I've also got a number of concerts coming up and am about to release some new music. To stay current on all of this, I encourage you to subscribe to my newsletter and follow me on Instagram, both linked in the video description. Alright, Leonard Cohen's studio album tier list part 4 of 4. Let's go. 12. Old Ideas. There is a very Cohen-esque story that preceded the making of this album and his late career renaissance in general. The broad strokes of it are that his manager embezzled all of his money and forced him back both onto the road and into the studio, and in so doing catalyzed some of the very best work of his career, highlighted by this album. And on this album, it's the wisdom both to write across many styles and about many subjects, both of this world and not, and he manages to do so here more effectively and consistently than at almost any other point of his career. This album features some of his very best what I would call rabbinical writing, like Going Home, Show Me the Place, and Come Healing. It also features some of his most funny writing that doesn't give way to glibness, like on Anyhow and Different Sides, and it features at least one straight-up beautiful love song in Crazy to Love You. It reaches for solace both in the heavens and very much here on earth, as in Banjo, where he is moved to write by the splinters of an instrument on the shore of a beach. And it also is one of Cohen's most satisfying production approaches. I appreciate and to some extent applaud his willingness, his eagerness to use the tools of commercialism to give his lyrics a wider audience. By which I mean I can get over the drum machines on First We Take Manhattan. But I think ultimately the Cohen production approaches that are most satisfying to me are the ones where real instruments are being played by real human beings. Cohen's writing is just so deeply rooted in the human heart, in the human experience, in what it feels like on a moment-to-moment basis to be a human, that the more tactile his production is, the more commensurate it feels with that style of writing. There's just some really terrific playing on this album. The trumpet in Amen. Cohen's solitary, melancholic guitar in Crazy to Love You. That wonderfully soporific guitar riff in Lullaby. Some songs are slow and reflective and meditative, others are upbeat and sarcastic and funny. It's a compact house with many different rooms, each of which has a different comfort to offer. When I'm recommending that people get into Leonard Cohen, I most frequently recommend his first album, Songs of Leonard Cohen, but I next most frequently recommend this one. All it takes to enjoy this album is to be somebody who wants to hear a lyricist straining for the heavens, by which I mean reaching as deeply into the human heart as he can. I think the only thing this album is missing is the sort of seminal cultural appeal that his first album had, which is a factor beyond his control, but you can't control all the factors that make a work of art good or bad, pleasing or not. But suffice to say, I love everything about this album. I would put it just behind Songs of Leonard Cohen in his S tier. 13. Popular Problems. I don't know if there's any other artist where I would put one of their very best albums and perhaps their worst album back to back in their discography. But for Leonard Cohen, I do. Popular Problems feels in every way to me like an outtakes collection from Old Ideas. And I just think for an artist like Leonard Cohen, the separation between their top tier stuff and their second tier stuff is quite extreme. I keep invoking this Bob Dylan comparison, but If Bob Dylan is somebody who writes when he gets struck by lightning and Leonard Cohen is somebody who writes by sheer brute force of labor, the two writing approaches leave you with very different outtakes in your vault. There are moments in Dylan's career when he was in the middle of a lightning storm. It was giving him more songs than he could ever fit on a single studio album. Cohen was a laborer, and so the songs whose labors don't quite produce fruit are much, much less satisfying than those that do. And Popular Problems to me is full of a lot of songs that don't really bear that much fruit. Most of these songs to me have a more effective companion song on Old Ideas or elsewhere in his career. Samson in New Orleans to me is a less coherent song in the very same mood with the very same aim as Come Healing. Nevermind, which I think is the album's best song, is a song whose mood of spooky anonymity is outdone by The Partisan many years ago. I know that it's not a Leonard Cohen composition, but he certainly made it his own. And then I just don't think the production on this album is terribly coherent or effective, especially when the lyrics are not deep enough to satisfy on their own, like in the song My Oh My. He also just commits that unforgivable sin to me of producing a song in that early 2010s stomp clap folk style in Did I Ever Love You? You know, perhaps in a good microcosm of this album, the closing track, You Got Me Singing, feels to me like something an audience member would say as they're watching Leonard Cohen sing Hallelujah. A tendril of inspiration spawned by a work of genius, not a work of genius in and of itself. I don't love how this album sounds. I generally don't find its lyrics as stimulating or deep or rich as the lyrics almost anywhere else in his career. It brings me no pleasure to do this, but I think I would make it the sole member of Leonard Cohen's D tier. 14. You Want It Darker. This thing happens to artists at the end of their lives where every work they produce past a certain age is interpreted as their death album, novel, painting, whatever. This first happened to Bob Dylan at Time Out of Mind in 1997, which now is almost 30 years ago. The first time I know of it happening to Leonard Cohen was 2004's Dear Heather, which at the time of this one's release was 12 years before. But, and perhaps this is just because we know Cohen actually did pass away not long after this album's release, I think it is fair to look at this album as Cohen's mortality album. And it's not just because of that, it's also because numerous of the songs feel like they are explicitly about the experience of looking at your imminent mortality. I'm thinking of You Want It Darker, I'm thinking of Leaving the Table, and of Traveling Light. I'm also thinking of Steer Your Way, which coming at the end of the album almost feels like an instruction manual for those of us who are still living and still having to negotiate the pleasures and pains and disappointments of life. I'm also thinking about the production on this album, which for the most part is pretty bleak, pretty spooky, pretty dark. I'm fortunate never to have been in this position, but it feels like what I imagine looking into that unknowable, ineffable abyss would feel like. I'm also thinking about the front cover of this album, which may be Cohen's best album cover, on which he can be seen peering from a world of light into a world of dark and dangling a cigarette sassily over the threshold, which is a good encapsulation of what he's doing in the contents of the album. He is certainly looking into the abyss, but never without the sort of knowing sarcasm that categorizes so much of his best writing. As he self-deprecatingly acknowledges and plays the sacred chord progression in the first verse of Hallelujah, he both decries and accepts the terms of the odious deal that dying is in You Want It Darker. So, confirmation bias aside, I think this does set itself up to be and succeeds at being a death album. I think the only way in which this album is unsuccessful is that it commits a sin that is common to a lot of Leonard Cohen's good but not great albums, which is that it more or less wallows in the same mood for the duration. And as in Songs from a Room and 10 New Songs, which also commit this sin, the mood of choice is the delicious morass of melancholy. On the Level and Steer Your Way momentarily lift us into a different dynamic zone, but not for long, and the deviation is not all that extreme. But it's a relatively minor mark against what I think is generally quite a successful album. Rarely, if ever, has another popular musician gone so explicitly to these places. He is to be posthumously commended for the effort. I would put You Want It Darker in the very last place of Cohen's A tier. 15. Thanks for the Dance. Thanks for the Dance is unique in a couple of ways. It's his only posthumous album. It was released 3 years after his death, and it's his only album on which he collaborates so extensively with his son, Adam Cohen. The fact that it's a collaborative album is itself not unique. He had close musical collaborators and co-writers in John Lissauer and Phil Spector and Anjani Thomas, Sharon Robinson, Patrick Leonard, and others throughout his career. The difference here is that the collaboration with Adam is unique and that he was not alive to oversee it. So the question I think think we are forced to ask in that context is, does this feel like a Leonard Cohen album? The subsequent question I think we're forced to ask is, well, what does a Leonard Cohen album feel like? The way that I would answer that is an excellent set of lyrics that's reinforced by music that doesn't try too hard to push its way to center stage. And by that definition, yes, this almost always feels like a Leonard Cohen album. The music that Adam composes for Happens to the Heart, Listen to the Hummingbird, and others feels very much like the subtle, spooky, dark music that we would have heard on You Want It Darker. The music that Anjani Thomas composes for Thanks for the Dance feels very much like the music she composed and that Leonard Cohen approved for Crazy to Love You on 2012's Old Ideas. The percussive moments of emphasis in the song Puppets reinforce the reflective indictment that that song is. The only place I think where the musically egregiously does not play this role is The Night of Santiago. Maybe it's just that I have an issue with that song more broadly, that it does feel like at heart Leonard Cohen going, I had a great time getting laid this one time, which is maybe the sentence that categorizes more of his songs than any other single sentence in his entire career. And it also just feels different coming from the mouth of an 82-year-old than it did coming from the mouth of a 36-year-old. The one other thing I would say is that some of these lyrics feel not quite finished by Leonard Cohen's standards. I have to think he would have cut or rewritten a verse or two from Happens to the Heart. I have to think he would have been suspicious of whether The Goal was a worthy inclusion on this album. And knowing his penchant for labor, I wonder where else he might have pushed the song Puppets before settling on these images. Perhaps it's just that I know too much about how this album was conceived, but there is just an unfinished feeling I get from some of these lyrics. But on the other hand, I got that same feeling from Popular Problems in much greater volume. It's not nearly as much of a concern here. Ultimately, too, the song Thanks for the Dance is one of his greatest compositions. In it, he describes dancing with somebody who is a little bit reluctant to dance with him, but he's sort of saying, I know this isn't exactly what you had in mind, but it would mean a lot to me if you just sort of played the part and tried to enjoy yourself. And I feel like that's very much the experience Leonard Cohen had of life. It's like neither one of us wants all that deeply to be here right now, but we are, so we might as well do our best. And as a way to cap off his career, it's a lovely encapsulation, a lovely song, and a lovely sentiment. There's a ton of heart in this project. It is faithful to the balance of lyrics and music that Cohen tended to bring to his albums. And as far as a posthumous work of art goes that is helmed by somebody other than the artist in question, I think it is very successful. As a self-contained project, it's pretty satisfying. I think there may be one or two songs that rank among Cohen's best, and so I would put it just ahead of Death of a Ladies' Man in his B tier. There's a few immediate takeaways I have having now reflected on all of Leonard Cohen's musical output. One is that there's a virtue in sparseness. In the same interval in which other artists would have produced 2 or 3 times as many albums, Cohen produced just 15 musical albums. Each is not as brilliant as the last, but I think for a writer like Leonard Cohen, for whom it took a lot of labor, less is more. Another conclusion I would draw just has to do with the way that Cohen dealt with his particular type of suffering. I've said this again and again throughout this series. I think roughly for the first half of his musical career, you see a man wrestling and wrestling and wrestling again with the consequences of his own desires. In the second half of his career, I think you see him wrestling less and less with his own desires and more with the desires that are common to all humanity. And honestly, I think it's in this second half of his career that he produced more classic, timeless work than in the first half. You know, the first half has the advantage of having taken place in the 60s and 70s, so we remember a lot of those songs from that era probably more than the songs from the second half of his career, but that's not necessarily because they're always better. The work, for example, on Old Ideas outmeasures the work on Songs of Love and Hate, including the songs that everybody knows from it, by a long shot. For me personally, the takeaway from that is kind of if and when you am stranded in a period of not knowing what to do next as an artist, looking outside rather than looking inside might be the right way forward. And the third thing I would say has to do with the types of artists who tend to fare well in the last leg of their career. The way that I would summarize it is that poets tend to outlive rockers. I mean this both literally and figuratively. The value of poetry is the extent to which it reflects some kind of experience. I think the value of great rock is the extent to which it eviscerates that kind of experience, which in general I think requires youth, requires libido, requires muscle, requires sweat, requires the kinds of things that people in the latter stages of their lives are kind of short on. But if you're a poet, you can always conjure a good reflection of your experience, and as you get older, you are probably more equipped to do so. Leonard Cohen is a prime example of this phenomenon. So it's been a pleasure for me to do this deep dive. I hope that you guys have gotten some value out of it as well. And now let us address some of your comments on the last video. Objectively L writes, when ranking albums, I notice your criteria values an album that does what it sets out to do in the most effective way it can, more than an album that might have higher highs but is not the best version of what it sets out to do in that artist's discography. What about this way of ranking better suits you? I love albums. The album as a unit is an art form that I really venerate, substantially more so than just a standalone song. Achieving some sort of short-term effect is not nearly as moving to me as achieving a long-term effect. The phenomenon of a long-term effect complicates and deepens all of the short-term effects contained therein. Take A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall from the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. I've always thought of it as one of the most earnest songs in Dylan's catalog, and essentially a mission statement on who he intends to be as an artist. Considered in isolation, that's what it is. Considered in the context of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, there's much more to the story. The guy that wrote A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall is also the guy who wrote Bob Dylan's Blues, essentially a series of knock-knock jokes. Seeing both the many temperaments of the artist and the many ways those temperaments interact with each other deepens and changes the effect of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. You couldn't have that effect in isolation. You can have that effect over the course of an entire album. The best albums are not merely collections of songs, they are spells that could only be cast by these individual items in this particular order. Jeff Kane writes, any thoughts on Cohen's drawings and how they relate to the music? Quaintly, Cohen is no master of illustration, but his illustrations do have something to tell us about his art. I think especially of the front cover of Book of Longing. It almost looks like a child's drawing. This is interesting because there is very little about the rest of Cohen's work that bears any imprints of childhood or adolescence or anything before advanced age. And I think it has something to say about a wish that may be lurking latent inside of him, one where simple beauty is enough. Just like Bob Dylan's paintings, are they the work of a master? No. But do they have something to tell us? Certainly. Max Fishburne 2513 writes, out of Dylan and Cohen, who do you think spoke about the world around them politically and socially in a, quote, better, unquote, way? Dylan. The reason I say that is because most of Leonard Cohen's writing is about the world inside of him, and he gets at the world outside of him by way of writing into his own sorrow and suffering and longing. Dylan does his fair share of that as well, but I think if you go through both of their catalogs, you'll find many more examples of Dylan writing explicitly about the trials of the external world. I mean, just across Dylan's first several albums, you can find dozens of examples of him writing about a world in which the protagonist is not really that much of a character. It's All Right Ma, Gates of Eden, Desolation Row, the I in these songs doesn't seem to have that much to do with Dylan specifically. Whereas in Cohen's catalog, I think it takes him much longer to start writing about a world in which he is not the protagonist. I would even go so far as to say it might not be until Various Positions in 1984 when he really starts to do that in earnest. I don't mean to say this makes either of them a better writer, but on the question of who wrote better about the world around them, I think I give it to Dylan. James Berkovich writes, what's worse, Dylan's 80s or Cohen's 80s? Obviously Dylan's. He produced far more music, but when you compare the memorability of his music versus the music Cohen produced in the 80s, there's really no competition. I count a few great Dylan songs from the 80s, but Cohen produced arguably his greatest writing in the 80s. 2 Cohen albums of mostly excellent songs certainly beats 6 very uneven Dylan albums. Stephen Maxner1275 writes, apropos of nothing, I'm a big fan of Townes Van Zant's Rearview Mirror, where it sounds like he is playing in front of 15 people in a West Texas bar. In your opinion, where, if at all, does Van Zant fall in this particular poetic playing pantheon? Not that close to the top. The issue I have with Townes Van Zant, as a lyricist especially, is that he suffers from a syndrome I would attribute to Elliott Smith, Radiohead, and several others, that of humorlessness. He described his own songs as hopeless, and by and large, I have to agree. Very central criteria to me in the estimation of my lyrical heroes is their ability to balance different and indeed contradictory moods within their songs. The obvious one would be comedy and tragedy, but there are other ones like sarcasm and earnestness, piousness and crassness, states of being that sit at the opposite ends of a spectrum, but despite their contradictory natures, neither are any less a part of what it means to be a human. To see them both represented well in a song without either one clashing with the other is an incredible magic trick. In Towns, I mostly see sadness. Beautifully articulated sadness, sure, but less multidimensional sadness than in Cohen, Dylan, or my other heroes. Alright, that is the end of the Leonard Cohen studio album tier list. If you have any thoughts on what should come next, tier list or content-wise, I'm always happy to hear those as well. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to my page. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.